Most people believe that someone with narcissistic traits is impossible to hurt. They appear confident, emotionally untouchable, and completely unaffected by the opinions of others. They carry themselves as if criticism doesn't exist, as if rejection has never crossed their path, and as if they're always the most important person in every room they enter. But that image is often far more fragile than it appears. In many cases, what looks like confidence is actually a carefully maintained self-image that depends on constant admiration, validation, and attention from other people. The surprising part is that the things capable of shaking that self-image aren't always dramatic betrayals or major life events. Sometimes they're the ordinary moments that happen every single day, a conversation that doesn't revolve around them, a compliment given to someone else, a boundary calmly enforced, a person who simply stops chasing their approval. These everyday experiences may seem insignificant to most people, but to someone whose identity is heavily tied to external validation, they can feel deeply unsettling. Today's episode isn't about celebrating anyone's pain. It's about understanding emotional patterns so you can recognize them in your own relationships and stop blaming yourself for reactions that were never really about you. Once you understand these 6 everyday moments, you'll begin seeing certain behaviors through a completely different lens. The first everyday thing is surprisingly simple. Someone else becomes the center of attention. Imagine you're sitting with friends at dinner when everyone begins congratulating another person on a recent promotion. They're laughing, asking questions, celebrating their success, and genuinely enjoying the moment. Most emotionally secure people naturally join in because another person's achievement doesn't reduce their own value. They don't feel smaller simply because someone else is shining. But for people with strong narcissistic traits, attention can feel like a limited resource. If someone else receives admiration, they may unconsciously experience it as losing something themselves. That's why you may notice subtle changes in their behavior. They interrupt the conversation, redirect the topic toward themselves, remind everyone of one of their own accomplishments, or quietly criticize the person receiving praise. Sometimes the criticism is obvious, other times it's disguised as humor or concern. The goal isn't always to destroy the other person's success, it's often to restore their own sense of importance. This is one of the biggest differences between healthy confidence and fragile confidence. Healthy confidence says, "I'm happy for you because your success doesn't threaten mine." Fragile confidence quietly whispers, "If you're being admired, what does that say about me?" Understanding this difference explains countless awkward moments that seem to appear out of nowhere during family gatherings, workplaces, and friendships. Now here's something even more interesting. Have you ever stopped texting someone just to see whether they'd ever reach out first? Not to play games, not to punish them, simply because you realized you were always the one keeping the relationship alive. At first, nothing happens. Hours turn into days, and eventually they contact you. But instead of saying they missed you, the conversation begins with criticism. "You've changed. I guess you're too busy for everyone now. Must be nice forgetting the people who care about you." If you've experienced something like this, you probably felt confused. You weren't trying to create distance. You simply wanted balance. In relationships where one person expects constant reassurance, however, your independence can feel like rejection. That's why healthy boundaries sometimes trigger unhealthy reactions. The moment you stop chasing someone, they no longer receive the same emotional confirmation they once depended on. For emotionally secure people, relationships naturally move back and forth. Sometimes one person reaches out first, sometimes the other does. But when someone's self-worth depends on always feeling prioritized, even a small shift can feel much larger than it actually is. Ironically, the healthier you become emotionally, the less willing you are to constantly seek someone's approval. And that's often when the relationship itself begins to change. The second everyday thing is closely connected to the first, but it's even quieter. It happens the moment you become genuinely happy without needing their permission. Maybe you start a new hobby, make new friends, improve your health, or simply become more peaceful than you've been in years. You smile more often. You stop explaining every decision. You begin trusting yourself again. Instead of celebrating that growth, some emotionally manipulative people may become strangely uncomfortable. They might tell you you've become arrogant. They may joke that you've changed too much. They may even suggest they miss the old you. But what exactly do they mean by the old you? In many situations, they aren't talking about the happiest version of you. They're talking about the version that constantly looked for approval, tolerated unhealthy behavior, and questioned every decision. Personal growth changes relationship dynamics. When someone learns to value themselves, they're naturally less willing to accept disrespect. That shift can feel threatening to anyone who benefited from their previous self-doubt. And that's why one of the most powerful things you can do in any relationship is quietly continue growing. Not to prove anyone wrong, not to make someone jealous, but because emotionally healthy people don't need to shrink themselves to make someone else feel important. They understand that real connection is built on mutual respect, not constant control. The next everyday habit seems even smaller, yet it reveals more about emotional security than almost anything else. It begins the moment someone hears the word no, without anger, without an argument, and without an apology. It begins the moment someone hears the word no, without anger, without an argument, and without an apology. For many people, a respectful no is simply part of everyday life. Sometimes you're too busy to help. Sometimes you need rest. Sometimes you disagree with an idea, and sometimes your priorities simply don't match someone else's expectations. Healthy relationships can usually survive these moments because both people understand that boundaries are not personal attacks. They're simply a way of protecting time, energy, and emotional well-being. But for someone with strong narcissistic traits, a calm boundary can sometimes feel much bigger than it actually is. Instead of hearing, "I can't do that today," they may hear, "You're no longer in control," or "You're not as important as you thought." That's why a simple refusal may be followed by guilt trips, silent treatment, sarcasm, or comments designed to make you question your decision. The goal isn't always to change your answer immediately. Sometimes it's to make setting boundaries feel so uncomfortable that you hesitate to do it again. Think back to a time when you politely declined a request and somehow ended up feeling guilty, even though you had done nothing wrong. Maybe you explained yourself over and over, hoping they would understand. Maybe you apologized repeatedly just to keep the peace. Over time, many people begin believing that protecting themselves automatically makes them selfish. But emotional maturity teaches something very different. You can care about someone deeply and still say no. You can be kind without becoming available every second of the day. You can love people without sacrificing your own peace. The moment you truly understand that, unhealthy dynamics begin to lose their power, because people who depend on unlimited access to your time often struggle when they discover your kindness now comes with healthy limits. Another everyday thing that can be surprisingly difficult for someone with narcissistic tendencies is watching you receive genuine respect from other people. Notice that this isn't the same as receiving attention. Respect is different. Attention can disappear in minutes, but respect is earned through consistency, honesty, and character. Imagine your coworkers begin trusting your opinion. Friends start coming to you for advice. Family members recognize how dependable you've become. None of these moments are dramatic, yet they quietly change how people see you. Someone who relies heavily on appearing superior may feel unsettled watching your credibility grow naturally. Unlike admiration based on appearance or status, genuine respect can't be demanded. It develops slowly through repeated actions, and that's exactly what makes it so powerful. In some situations, an emotionally manipulative person may respond by questioning your achievements, minimizing your contributions, or suggesting you only succeeded because you were lucky. These comments often leave people wondering, why couldn't they just be happy for me? The answer isn't always simple, but when someone's self-image depends on feeling more important than those around them, another person's steady growth can feel unexpectedly threatening. Here's another situation that happens almost every day but reveals a great deal about emotional security. Someone corrects a mistake. Think about how emotionally healthy people usually respond after making an error. They may feel embarrassed for a moment, admit what happened, apologize if necessary, and move forward. It's uncomfortable, but it doesn't destroy their sense of identity because they don't believe being wrong makes them worthless. They understand that mistakes are part of learning. For someone with fragile self-esteem, however, criticism can feel much more personal. Even a small correction may be experienced as an attack on who they are, rather than feedback about what they did. That's why ordinary conversations sometimes become surprisingly defensive. A simple suggestion turns into an argument. Helpful advice is treated as disrespect. Instead of discussing the issue itself, the focus shifts toward protecting pride. This doesn't happen in every case, but it's a pattern many therapists and researchers have observed in relationships involving strong narcissistic traits. Understanding this difference doesn't mean accepting disrespect. It simply helps explain why some reactions seem far larger than the original situation. One of the biggest turning points in any healing journey happens when you stop trying to convince someone to see your worth. At first, this feels almost impossible because most people naturally want to be understood. They explain their intentions, defend their choices, and hope that one more conversation will finally change everything. But eventually, something shifts. You realize your value isn't determined by whether one particular person recognizes it. You stop arguing over your character. You stop chasing validation that never seems to last. Instead, you quietly invest your energy in people who already appreciate honesty, kindness, and mutual respect. Ironically, this emotional detachment often changes the relationship more than years of arguments ever did. When someone realizes they can no longer control your emotions as easily as before, they may become confused. The old strategies no longer produce the same results. Guilt doesn't work the way it used to. Criticism doesn't shake your confidence like it once did. Silence no longer sends you into panic. That's because emotional independence changes everything. It removes the constant need to prove yourself. What's fascinating is that none of these everyday moments involve dramatic confrontations. No one is shouting. No one is throwing things or making threats. They're ordinary situations that reveal extraordinary emotional patterns. A simple boundary, a quiet success, a respectful correction, a growing sense of self-confidence. These moments often tell you far more about the health of a relationship than the biggest arguments ever could. And perhaps the most revealing everyday experience of all begins when you stop reacting the way you always used to. Instead of defending yourself, apologizing immediately, or chasing after every misunderstanding, you remain calm. You don't become cold or cruel. You simply refuse to let someone else's emotional storms determine your own peace. That quiet change often says more than 1,000 explanations ever could, and it's exactly where the next part of this story begins. That quiet change often says more than 1,000 explanations ever could, and it's exactly where the next part of this story begins. One of the most powerful shifts you can make in any relationship is learning to stay emotionally steady when someone expects you to react. Many people with strong narcissistic traits don't necessarily seek conflict for its own sake. What they often seek is reassurance that they still have emotional influence. If a single comment can ruin your entire day, if one sarcastic remark sends you into hours of self-doubt, or if every disagreement forces you to chase after their approval, they receive confirmation that their words still carry tremendous weight. But the moment you begin responding instead of reacting, something changes. You listen calmly. You refuse to argue over every accusation. You don't raise your voice just because someone else has raised theirs. You answer respectfully when necessary. And when the conversation becomes unhealthy, you walk away without trying to win. That emotional steadiness can be surprisingly difficult for someone who expects every interaction to revolve around emotional control. Think about how many arguments continue only because both people keep feeding them. One person criticizes, the other defends, one interrupts, the other speaks louder. Before long, neither person remembers what the disagreement was actually about. But emotional maturity works differently. It recognizes that not every accusation deserves a response, and not every misunderstanding requires a lengthy explanation. Sometimes protecting your peace is more important than proving your point. This doesn't mean becoming silent out of fear. It means understanding that your emotional stability is valuable. The calmer you become, the more clearly you can recognize unhealthy patterns that once kept you trapped. Many survivors of emotionally manipulative relationships say the biggest change wasn't finding better arguments. It was realizing they no longer needed to participate in every emotional battle they were invited into. Another everyday thing that can quietly challenge someone with narcissistic tendencies is seeing you build meaningful relationships with other people. Healthy friendships, supportive coworkers, caring family members, and emotionally mature partners all provide something that manipulation cannot: consistent respect. Imagine someone who once believed you depended entirely on their approval suddenly watching you laugh freely with new friends, receive encouragement from colleagues, or enjoy peaceful conversations that don't leave you emotionally exhausted. That kind of growth changes the entire dynamic. It becomes much harder to convince someone they're unworthy when they're surrounded by people who consistently treat them with kindness. This is one reason emotionally manipulative individuals may sometimes criticize your new relationships. They might say your friends are using you, claim your family doesn't really understand you, or insist that no one cares about you the way they do. Sometimes these comments are intentional. Other times they reflect genuine insecurity. Either way, the effect can be the same if you're not aware of what's happening. You begin questioning the very relationships that are helping you heal. Here's something worth remembering. Isolation rarely happens overnight. It usually begins with small comments repeated over time. I don't think your friend really likes you. Your family doesn't appreciate you. Your coworkers are jealous of you. Individually, these statements may seem harmless, but repeated often enough, they can slowly change the way someone sees the people around them. That's why reconnecting with emotionally healthy relationships is often one of the most important parts of recovery. Safe people remind you that respect doesn't require fear. Love doesn't require constant anxiety. Real connection doesn't depend on walking on eggshells every day. Once you experience relationships built on trust instead of control, unhealthy dynamics become much easier to recognize. There's another everyday habit that often surprises people: gratitude. Not receiving gratitude, but watching someone else live with it. People who regularly appreciate what they already have tend to compare themselves less often. They celebrate small victories. They notice kindness. They enjoy simple moments instead of constantly chasing status or admiration. Gratitude creates emotional stability because it shifts attention away from what is missing and toward what is already meaningful. For someone whose self-worth depends heavily on external validation, this mindset can seem almost impossible to understand. They may wonder why someone isn't trying harder to impress everyone else, or why they're content without constantly competing for attention. The truth is that genuine contentment doesn't require an audience. It grows quietly through purpose, healthy relationships, and self-respect. That's why emotionally secure people often appear calmer. They don't need every room to notice them because their identity isn't built on being noticed. Perhaps the most unexpected everyday thing is simply watching you move on. Not dramatically, not with revenge, not by trying to prove anything, just peacefully continuing your life. You focus on your work, you laugh again, you pursue goals that once felt impossible. You spend time with people who make you feel safe instead of anxious. Little by little, the version of yourself that constantly needed approval begins to disappear. This is often confusing for someone who expected your world to continue revolving around them. They may test old patterns to see if they still work. A critical comment, an unexpected message, a reminder of an old mistake. They're looking for the reaction they used to receive. But this time, something is different. You're no longer measuring your worth through their opinion. You're measuring your life by your own values. That quiet transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens through hundreds of ordinary decisions made consistently over time, and it prepares you for the final lesson, the one that explains why true emotional freedom has nothing to do with changing another person and everything to do with changing the way you see yourself. It prepares you for the final lesson, the one that explains why true emotional freedom has nothing to do with changing another person and everything to do with changing the way you see yourself. This is where everything you've heard so far comes together. The 6 everyday things we've explored aren't magical weaknesses, nor do they guarantee how any individual will react. They're patterns that often emerge in relationships where self-worth depends heavily on admiration, comparison, and control. More importantly, they're reminders that your greatest strength isn't learning how to hurt someone back. It's learning how to stop handing them control over your emotional world. Think about the moments that changed your life the most. Chances are they weren't the loudest arguments or the biggest confrontations. They were the quiet decisions no one else noticed. The day you stopped apologizing for having boundaries. The moment you realized you didn't need to explain every choice you made. The first time you accepted a compliment without immediately putting yourself down. The evening you spent with people who left you feeling peaceful instead of emotionally drained. Those ordinary moments may not seem dramatic, but they slowly reshape the way you see yourself. And once your identity is built on self-respect instead of someone else's approval, manipulation begins losing its foundation. Many people spend years trying to understand why they could never say or do the right thing. They replay conversations in their minds, wondering if they should have been more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, or more careful with their words. But healing often begins with a completely different question. Instead of asking, "What could I have done differently?" you begin asking, "Why did I believe it was my responsibility to manage another person's emotions in the first place?" That single question changes everything. It shifts your attention away from endless self-blame and toward healthier emotional boundaries. You start recognizing that compassion doesn't mean tolerating disrespect, and kindness doesn't require abandoning yourself. You can wish someone well while also protecting your own peace. One of the greatest misconceptions about emotionally manipulative relationships is the belief that freedom comes from finally winning the argument. In reality, emotional freedom usually arrives much more quietly. It appears the day you no longer feel the need to convince someone of your worth. It appears when criticism no longer defines your identity, when silence no longer fills you with panic, and when someone else's approval stops determining whether you have a good day or a bad one. That's real confidence. It's not loud, it doesn't demand attention, it doesn't need to prove anything, it simply exists, and because it comes from within, it can't be taken away by someone else's opinion. As you continue growing, you may notice something surprising. The people who genuinely care about you become easier to recognize. Healthy people celebrate your progress instead of competing with it. They respect your boundaries even when they're disappointed. They apologize when they're wrong. They encourage your goals instead of feeling threatened by them. They don't keep score, collect your mistakes, or constantly remind you of who you used to be. They leave room for growth because they understand that everyone is learning. That's what emotionally safe relationships look like. They don't require perfection. They require honesty, respect, and mutual effort. If you've spent a long time around criticism or emotional manipulation, that kind of relationship may feel unfamiliar at first. You might even mistake calmness for boredom because you've become so accustomed to emotional chaos. But peace isn't boring. Peace is what allows trust to grow. It's what gives people the freedom to be themselves without constantly worrying about saying the wrong thing. And once you've experienced that kind of connection, it's incredibly difficult to settle for anything less. So if there's one message to remember from today's episode, let it be this: never measure your value by the reaction of someone who benefits from your self-doubt. Your worth was never meant to rise and fall with another person's approval. The strongest people aren't the ones who always win arguments or always have the perfect response. They're the ones who continue becoming kinder, wiser, and more emotionally grounded without allowing bitterness to define them. Every healthy boundary you set, every peaceful decision you make, every act of self-respect you practice is another step toward a life that no longer depends on fear, comparison, or constant validation. One day, you'll look back and realize that the greatest victory wasn't changing someone with narcissistic traits. It wasn't making them understand your pain or finally admit they were wrong. The greatest victory was discovering that you didn't need those things to move forward. You didn't need permission to heal. You didn't need validation to know your experience mattered. You didn't need someone else's approval to recognize your own worth. The moment you truly understand that, the emotional chains begin to fall away. So keep growing, keep protecting your peace, keep surrounding yourself with people who celebrate your success instead of fearing it. Keep choosing honesty over games, respect over control, and self-awareness over endless comparison. Because the healthiest life isn't built by trying to become more important than everyone else. It's built by becoming more authentic than you were yesterday. And when your confidence comes from character instead of constant validation, no one has the power to take it from you. That's not just emotional strength. That's genuine freedom. And once you experience that freedom, you'll never again mistake control for love or attention for respect. You'll finally understand that the happiest life isn't one spent trying to win someone else's approval. It's one spent becoming the person you were always capable of being.